The next part of social development is about the influence of daycare on socialization with young children. And as the percentage of women in our labor market continues to increase, more and more children are spending time in a child care center or with other guardians. And this whole section really explores how this affects child development. So the first sort of daycare they talk about is care in the child's home. Um, and this is when a member of the extended family becomes the caregiver of the child. Because this arrangement is created within the family and it's usually pretty private, less is known about this type of care than any other type of daycare. The advantages here is that a child is familiar with their physical environment and their caregiver, and there's a lot of flexibility with scheduling. Disadvantages here is the caregiver does not have formal training and kids don't get to participate in peer activities like they would in a child care center. The next type of care is family daycare, and this is where the caregiver provides child care within the caregiver's home. Usually they have about 1 to 15 children at a time. And this is really the most common and the least expensive type of daycare for families who need to look outside their extended family. Advantages here is it's inexpensive, home base, and a neighborhood setting, and there's group play. But the disadvantage here is that there's a lack of accountability and stability. Next up is the child care centers. And there are a lot of different types of child care or daycare centers. First would be a private daycare center, which is an independent business and usually limits its size from about 10 to 20 kids. These are available to anyone who can afford it, but they tend to be pretty pricey. Commercial daycare is larger in size, and they're usually a national or a regional chain. They usually have good facilities, a lot of training for the faculty, and educational activities all tend to be pretty standardized amongst all of the different daycares. And then a community church center is daycare within a church. Here, the size, the training of the staff, and the facilities vary greatly depending on the characteristic of that particular church. Company centers are offered as employee benefits at certain companies, and they usually have great facilities and very professional staff. Public service centers are state sponsored and funded, and they provide service for low income families. The issue here is the availability can be very limited for families. And then lastly, there's research centers, which are associated with institutions of higher education. They are often a part of the undergrad program when they're studying child development or early education. Obviously, more research has been done with this sort of setting than any other sort of setting. And then, of course, families who are very affluent can always pay for a personal au pair or nanny, but that's really only accessible to families who can afford it. They say that the average cost for one child in childcare ranges from $500 to $800 a month. This is very limiting for a lot of families. Oftentimes, these families will resort to a family member providing childcare, which often makes it very difficult for that child to transition to elementary school. And then again, the factors that parents should look at when deciding a child care for their child would be a good staff to child ratio, high quality staff training, high wages for the staff, a safe environment, curriculum that promotes creativity, and they supervise motor activities and pay attention to language development as well. Parents should also be very flexible when choosing a child care center for their child because all children can respond differently to different situations. The next part of social development is parenting styles. Obviously, we all know that the different ways parents parent their children can have a huge effect on childhood development. The first sort of parenting is authoritarian parenting. This is parents who are demanding and are actively trying to shape and control their child's behavior. They often express little affection and restrict the emotional expression of their child. Children who grow up in this sort of household are at risk of growing up to be discontent, rebellious, withdrawn, and distrustful. Authoritative parenting is different, and it provides structure and direction for children while still allowing them freedom and the room for exploration and self-expression. They often have high levels of two-way communication, and they promote individuality while still communicating their consistent standards. This yields the best outcome out of any parenting styles, and kids are usually self-reliant, explorative, and content. Permissive parenting is when parents are very accepting, affirmative, and tolerant of their child's behavior. They have very few demands on punishment in their household. Oftentimes, children are less self-reliant, less explorative, and less self-controlled than children who are raised in other households. And then lastly, we have uninvolved parents, which we all know would be the worst option. And it's when parents who lack communication and lack any sort of affection towards their children. Next, I'm going to talk about play. Play is definitely a very important aspect of social development in children, and it allows children to actively encounter and engage with their environments. Children, when they're playing, can manipulate objects, and they can amuse themselves, make relationships with their peers, and really make sense of their world. From 0 to 1 year, they call it parallel play, and there's really no coordination of any sort of activity amongst children, but there is a noticeable interest and awareness of activities and of others. And then starting at age 1, there's a simple social play where the child does not just observe, but they start to make active attempts to mimic behaviors of others. Next up are childhood friendships. And as children grow older, more of their play involves others, which is really the basis of creating friendships. By age 3, kids can sustain play with their peers. They also talk about how play can be strongly affected by culture. An example of this is when kids are playing house. Their concept of what a mother and a father's role in the house varies greatly depending on their household that they grew up in. So they might play very different than another classmate or another friend because of the house that they grew up in. Lastly, I'm going to talk about play therapy, which is the use of theoretical models to establish an interpersonal process wherein trained play therapists use their therapeutic powers of play to help clients prevent or resolve psychosocial difficulties and achieve the optimal growth in development. Play therapy can be used with all different ages, even adults, but it's primarily used with kids aged 3 to 12. Since play functions as a mechanism of children to work through their fears and make sense of the meaning of their lives, play counseling is highly effective for therapy in young children.